So let's talk a little bit about this. This is Jacksonian Democracy and Manifest Destiny. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the second piece here in terms of like the growth of the United States, because we've laid this out for you in a nice little chart. You do need to know these pieces though. Okay, like when do these major land acquisitions, either by hook or crook, the United States grows because of some really solid land acquisitions. We get a lot of land for cheap, right? The Louisiana Purchase, as long as you're willing to ignore the people who it actually belong to. And, you know, there's that piece of that that is tied to this Manifest Destiny thing. Like things like Louisiana Purchase or the Mexican Cession after the Mexican-American War, or Texas joining the Union. Texas alone, because people don't appreciate this on a map. Texas, the state of Texas, is half the size of the European continent. You can fit half of the European continent into Texas alone, so it's an enormous piece of territory added to the United States. It doesn't cost a lot of money, that acquisition of this land. At least what we pay for it. The settling of it, that sort of thing may be different. But those things are laid out there, I think, pretty clearly for you. Those elections in the 1840s. You know, my students know this, that I always struggled with presidents between Jackson and Lincoln. I can have to remember them in order because honestly they don't matter. And it's just not. It's an era of meaningless presidents, and they're all like one-termers or less. And they're like, was it Taylor or Tyler? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I got a master's degree in it, and I don't know. It's because it is this. They stand in such which is maybe a kind of a nice way to kind of back up into Jackson. The difference is they stand in such stark contrast to Andrew Jackson, who is this larger than life. Whatever else he is larger than life. He is a very controversial figure in American history. A lot of people sort of see him as this, he is this great American success story on one hand. There's no question about that. He's born like just dirt poor. I mean, just into nothing. And he makes something of himself. And by the time he's the president, he's a very wealthy man. So he is this. So Jackson is sort of synonymous with this idea of the rise of the common man, a man who makes his way in the world on his own merits, through his own pluck and determination and toughness. His ruggedness, his individualism. So that he embodies that rugged individualism that we sort of talk about. On the other hand, he's also a homicidal racist maniac. I think a completely valid way of seeing Jackson. Native people, right? Native Americans. Think of him as Hitler. He's their Hitler. Indian removal and those things come from Jackson. Jackson remains the only president to ever openly, publicly defy a ruling of the Supreme Court in the Worcester v. Georgia ruling, where Chief Justice John Marshall says you can't remove the Cherokee from their land. It's now Georgia. It's theirs. You can't just take people's stuff and send them west, like just whatever. And Andrew Jackson famously says, well, John Marshall's made his ruling, let him enforce it. So he refuses to enforce a ruling of the Supreme Court. It's a real problem. Because Jackson's one of these kind of guys. So he's an interesting dude. John Meacham's book on him called American Lion, if you're fascinated by it, Meacham really gets at the dichotomy of Jackson if you're interested in him as a character. A pistol fighter and a duelist and all these other kinds of things, and maybe legitimately a military man. He's a tough dude. He was a fighter. There's no way around that. Really that you can deny it. But all really complicated. If you go on native reservations today, sometimes they won't use $20 bills because his picture is on it. And it's that kind of disdain for Andrew Jackson in some segments of our culture. Right? Jackson makes a name for himself in the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. Right? Notable as the one decisive land battle victory that the Americans win in the War of 1812. Also notable because it was completely unnecessary, because the war ended on Christmas Day of 1814. News traveled slowly. Jackson fights this big battle against the British. It was totally unnecessary. People didn't know that and didn't especially care about it. We had a military hero, and Americans love a conquering hero. We like that. And so Jackson kind of builds his name for himself as this guy who, as an Indian fighter, and a guy who fought the British, and a guy who, he's a Westerner. He's from Tennessee. He doesn't need that. He doesn't need the old East Coast money. He's not that kind of thing. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps, so to speak. People respond to that. He's common. He's not real well educated. He'll be the first president. He'll be the first president to, since George Washington, to not have gone to college. Washington was well educated, but not college educated like some of the other presidents. So Jackson is this new American. He represents this rise of the common man era of politics. And so he's really, really popular. So he decides to run for president in 1824. Now remember, 1824 is still this thing that we call the era of good feelings. It's not because people got along or that the feelings were really especially good, right? It's really what we're talking about is the fact that really, realistically, from 1800, the end of the Federalist Party, the Federalist Party starts to kind of fall apart by then, until really into the 1840s, you really effectively have one political party in America, right? Jackson represents the emergence of this new sort of thing, what we would now call the Democratic Party, right? The true origins of the modern Democratic Party start with Jackson. And people didn't realize at that time that the old Jeffersonian coalition was falling apart. And so you really kind of start to get these differences, these sort of political differences. By the 1850s, the Republican Party will emerge. So by the end of this era that we're talking about, our modern political parties exist. With different platforms than they have now and stuff, but they existed. So Jackson is real popular, and so everybody thinks, well, he's a Westerner, and he's popular with people. He'd be a great candidate for president in 1824. So he runs for president that year, and he wins a majority of the popular vote. And he wins a majority of the electoral vote. But he does not become the president in 1824. 1824 is one of these years where we have one of these contested elections. Because while he did win the majority of the electoral vote, he did not win a plurality. He didn't get to the magic number, and I don't know what it was in 1824. It's 270 now. I can't honestly tell you off the top of my head what it would have been in 1824. But whatever it was, Jackson didn't have enough. He had way more than anybody else. And so it comes down to the situation you got when nobody crossed the magic mark in the Electoral College. Like after the 2016 election, we're probably all a little more aware of the crazy nuances of the Electoral College than maybe we have been in a long time. It's a weird institution that we've had since the very beginning of the country and that nobody really seems to understand very well. All right? So everybody's saying, well, Jackson should be the president. He won because it's a four-way race that year with he and Henry Clay, a fellow Westerner. Clay was from Kentucky. That was the West then, Kentucky and Tennessee. We were gone quite so far west yet. And so another Westerner, and John Quincy Adams, the son of America's, in the early republic, our finest diplomat, overseas ambassador, and son of John Adams, the former president. And there's one other dude in that mix. I don't remember who he was. Crawford, thank you. Who was a South Carolina guy. Because there's all these regional, all these regional differences. And Jackson beats all of them handily. But he doesn't win outright. So it has to go to the House of Representatives. That's how the Constitution says that works. If somebody doesn't get across the magic threshold number in terms of the electoral vote, then it has to go to the House of Representatives. They'll take a vote and decide who the president's going to be. Now the problem with that is that the Speaker of the House at that time is Henry Clay, who is one of the guys who's just run for president. And Clay is, he's kind of a distant second. He's not whatever. So Clay's in a situation where he has the influence to make Congress vote any way he wants them to. He can make any one of these four people. He's the kingmaker, so to speak. But if he does that for himself, he says, okay, well, you all have to vote for me, and I'm going to be the president. Then that looks super, super corrupt. And Crawford is not enough of a name that anybody cares about. But Henry Clay hates Andrew Jackson. Politics is personal. And don't kid yourself. People say, oh, we can dismiss politics personal. No, all politics is personal. Right? Henry Clay hates Andrew Jackson, and there's no way on God's green earth he's going to make him the president if he has any say over it. So he does he goes to the next alternative, and he looks at John Quincy Adams, who is sort of like the embodiment of, right? Nobody really loves him, but nobody really hates him. And it's like, oh, you know, he's a capable diplomat, and he really wrote the Monroe Doctrine when he was Secretary of State. He speaks 6 languages, and he's been all over the world. He seems educated, and he's whatever. So he's going to be the president. And so he'll influence the House of Representatives to vote that way. Now, Jackson and his people will call this the corrupt bargain. Right? That's what we still refer to it. He says they made a dirty deal in the House of Representatives, and it cost me the election, and it cheated all you people who supported me out of it. And he's ridden this wave of populism into the White House. And you know how people get upset when the popular vote doesn't line up with the electoral vote. You just saw that in 2016. A lot of upset people in the country. Or in 2000, when President Bush didn't win the popular vote. Or in 1992, when President Clinton didn't win a majority of the popular vote. He won the most, but he didn't cross the 50% threshold. So people get upset when they feel like this is a challenge to the will of the people. Now imagine that when it seems like Congress steps in and puts the second runner-up in the White House. He wasn't even the first runner-up. Quincy Adams is like, who? Yeah, like, oh, that guy from Massachusetts? Yeah, I guess, whatever. So he's going to get one term, you can imagine. And the country largely hates him. And even though he tries to, he's guilty of the sin of saying, hey, maybe we should have more public universities, and maybe we should modernize our roads, and we need a national observatory for astronomy because that was really taking off as a science in the 1820s. So he doesn't propose anything radical or terrible. It's all good stuff for America, but nobody wants to do it because they just feel like he's not legitimate. You know, if you're at that point in time in your respective history classes where you're talking about Gerald Ford, you know, right there, I don't know where you guys are there. Like, you get that, like a guy who was probably perfectly qualified for the job, but nobody thought he was legitimate because nobody really elected him. You know, and so like nobody took anything he tried to do seriously. So Jackson will bide his time, and he'll come back in 1828, and he will crush John Quincy Adams, and he'll take the White House in 1828. Now Jackson, I mentioned that he is really you can see the origins of the modern Democratic Party here. Here's what the modern Democratic Party probably has in like common with Andrew Jackson. Not much, really, other than the use of the donkey. Right? The Republicans are an elephant, the Democrats are a donkey, because people started referring to that jackass, that Andrew Jackson became Andrew Jackass. Is what people would say about him. Jackass is a common euphemism for a donkey, and they would kind of start portraying him that way in political cartoons, and he thought it was funny, and he just seized on it. And so he uses the jackass as his personal symbol, like anything, you know, and it kind of becomes his thing, and it becomes associated with the Democratic Party, and has been since 1828. So it's just, but you know, that's just the kind of guy he is. He's kind of this, you don't like it, well, go jump in the lake kind of dude. You know, he's kind of got that attitude. So he wins in 1828 and kind of takes over, and we call this the era of common man politics. There was lots of voter turnout in this time, whatever else it is, at least among white men who could vote. That was who, you know, like the phrase universal white manhood suffrage is oxymoronic. It's not universal if it's white men. Right? I've never hated that, but it's as close as we can get in terms of precision. Because obviously we're not saying that women or minorities can vote yet. That would be crazy. You know, that was sarcasm. I don't mean that. Just because you don't know me very well. It's an obviously idiotic thing to say that this is in any way universal, but it takes out any kind of notion of land requirement. The idea that poor men could vote, and that poor men have a say in their government, and yet ordinary working class people. It was in that way. It's actually kind of empowering. But Jackson's a big believer in, like, well, you supported me, so so I'm going to owe you. I'll owe you something. At this time, we call this the spoils system. If you became the president or you got a high government office, you have the ability to sort of staff other government offices. You can give jobs to people. It says, hey, if you support me, I'll make you the postmaster general. You support me, I'll make you the ambassador to someplace sunny and pleasant. You know, whatever. right? You get some cushy government job. At one point in time, Andrew Jackson's postmaster general was illiterate. The person who was responsible for the delivery of the mail in America could not read or write. But was a big supporter of Jackson, and that was a big paycheck, right? Civil service, man, that was a big paycheck with a government pension. So they do this sort of thing. So Jackson's this kind of dude. He's loyal to his friends. He's uncompromising in his own beliefs. He's violent. Like, you can always respond. You can always guarantee Jackson will respond with violence. He also comes to the White House, and this is a piece that's left out of the story a lot, as a recently widowed husband. His wife had just died just a month or so before he took office. So she lives to see him elected, but not to ever be the first lady. So he's also mourning his wife, who he loved very deeply and killed at least one man over. Like, this is it was a complicated kind of guy, but whatever else he is, he loved his wife. And so it was this kind of thing that Jackson didn't like to see people. This thing on here, we talk about the Peggy Eaton affair. It'd be a footnote in history. He had some cabinet member, a guy named John Eaton, who had a wife named Peggy, and she was kind of a party girl. She liked to go out and stuff like that, and people kind of talked bad about her and said like she was a hoe and stuff like that. And he didn't like that because people said the same thing about his wife because she was divorced before she married him, and that was a controversial thing back in the day. So he shot and killed one man over that for implying that his own wife was, of loose morals. And so he never really liked that sort of thing when people would say this. And he took a liking to the Eatons, this young couple, and he didn't like that people talked bad about Mrs. Eaton. And so he catches, the way the story goes is he catches his vice president, John C. Calhoun, who had been a senator and a governor of South Carolina, who served in a variety of government functions and was the vice president at that time. And a bunch of his cabinet members kind of they were just like hanging around, like gossiping about her, about this woman. And he gets mad and just fires his whole cabinet over. Just fires them all. John C. Calhoun goes back to, you can't just fire the vice president, but John C. Calhoun goes back to South Carolina and doesn't really do the job of vice president in Washington, D.C. Now this creates bad blood between Jackson and John C. Calhoun. And this coincides with the early 1830s. He runs for re-election in the early 1830s. And so now you've got a sort of a prominent politician from a southern state that's always half threatening to secede anyway, who personally just hates the President of the United States, and the feeling is mutual. So the southern states kind of start, because of the issue of the tariffs were really high, which are import tariffs at the time, were really, really high. And a lot of the southern states feel like that penalizes them, right? Because they feel like they're being forced to buy New England-made goods because of the high import tariffs, when what they really want to do is buy finished goods from England because it was cheaper. Right? And the American government put all these tariffs on these things so that American goods, people to try to incentivize the selling of American goods. This is nationalism. It's a kind of protectionism in terms of economics. Well, the southern states are not happy about that, and they start talking about secession. Like, we're going to leave the Union because we're being treated unfairly. We were always talking about it before we finally got to the Civil War and they tried it. And so now John C. Calhoun's all pissed off at Andrew Jackson over the Peggy Eaton thing. He goes back to South Carolina, and now the secessionists kind of have somebody who they can kind of rally around. And John C. Calhoun kind of starts making some noise, like, well, maybe we should secede, or we should nullify acts of the federal government. Thomas Jefferson said we could do that. And so it creates this thing called the nullification crisis, right? So what happens if the federal government says this is the law in American ports and in American waters, and then American states won't enforce that law? You've got a crisis where the states are challenging the supremacy of the federal government. Well, Andrew Jackson doesn't tolerate anyone challenging his supremacy. I don't know that he cared about the supremacy of the federal government over the states or states' rights or any of that crap. I don't think he cared about anything, any of that nonsense. I think what he cared about was the idea that you would dare to challenge his authority. So he says to John C. Calhoun and the people of South Carolina in an open letter in a newspaper, because you'll enforce the law of the United States, it will be supreme, and if you don't, I will personally raise the army, and I will invade South Carolina, and I will hang John C. Calhoun, then the Vice President of the United States. Think about this. I will hang him from South Carolina's Capitol building. That's how this is going to go down. And everybody said, that's Andrew Jackson, and he means it. because he loved killing people. It's like one of his favorite pastimes. Okay? Rage and violence. Those are his, those were his meat and bread. Right? And so they backed down. Right? And maybe to Andrew Jackson's chagrin, I think he was kind of upset about it. When people asked him in 1844, when he was on his deathbed, if he had any kind of dying regrets, he said, "Yeah." He said, "I should have shot Henry Clay and hanged John C. Calhoun. His only regrets were there were people still alive that he forgot to kill." I mean, this guy's a little deranged, right? So all of that to say, Jackson strengthens the federal government, not because he was a big believer in a strong federal government, but because he was a strong believer in Andrew Jackson. He hated it. So his politics are very personal. If it was something, if the people involved, like he kills the Bank of the United States, it's not because the Second Bank of the United States. It's not because he disagrees with the idea of the Bank of the United States. It's because he didn't like Nicholas Biddle and Henry Clay, who were the guys who were associated with him. Well, those guys are buttholes to me, so whatever. I'm not gonna renew the charter on the bank. He just kills it. Right? So he basically shuts down the Second Bank of the United States that we had started to kind of finance the buildings of roads and bridges and stuff all over the place. And then he takes the money and he pays off the national debt. Because Andrew Jackson's not like Alexander Hamilton. He doesn't understand money the way Hamilton does. And he understands you have to have some debt. It's not a good idea for the United States to be entirely debt-free, because we have to be able to sell some of our debt in the form of treasury bonds, and that's what ensures our full faith and credit. It's kind of complicated, right? But if you pay it all off, then you don't have that commodity to sell. But he holds the distinction of being the only president to pay off the national debt. Pays off the national debt his last year in office in 1836. He leaves office. 6 months later, massive recession. The Panic of 1837 won't be matched in terms of the damage to the economy again until the Great Depression in the 1930s. Because Jackson doesn't understand money, but he's gone by then, so nobody blames him for that. They blame Martin Van Buren. Right? They blame Martin Van Buren so much for it that a second political party will finally emerge to break away from the Democratic Party, the Whig Party. It doesn't last very long. It only elects one person, William Henry Harrison. He dies a month in. And so there is this sort of thing that happens that it's like Jackson creates the modern Democratic Party, but then also creates the severing within that party that will ultimately lead to the creation of a bunch of other little parties that will ultimately coalesce into the Republican Party in the 1850s. So in some ways, you can maybe argue he creates both modern political parties, though that might be stretching that credit a little bit much. Beyond that, the rest of this stuff is the Manifest Destiny stuff, where pieces come in. Remember, all of this ties to this question of slavery. You just can't get around it. Like, there's a big piece of this that we're leaving out. That's not because we're just going to ignore slavery. I want to talk about that in context of the build-up to the Civil War, all which is happening at the same time. Everybody sees it coming. We'll talk about that on Tuesday when we come back from break. We'll look at that stuff, how slavery kind of mixes into this. Anybody have questions on that? Okay, if you have individual questions, hang around and ask me. If not, have a great